Okay, so since Stanley Fischer's tenure at the Bank of Israel, Israel is now one of the wealthiest countries in the world. In the OECD, one of the top 35 countries in terms of economic prosperity. Maybe not for everyone, as we'll hear, but certainly making a major strides in the local economy and in the global economy. And so I'll just share with you some things. We now have ISCAR building factories in China and South Korea funded by Warren Buffett. We have Netafim in India building the largest irrigation plant in the world in Karnataka. We have Teva now probably supplying many people in this room with their discount medicines, not only and playing a major role across Europe as well. And now I taught in Israel for 10 years at a school of entrepreneurship, and the woman who ran that school is now going around Europe teaching about how to teach entrepreneurship across all the countries in Europe. That isn't an answer to Hitler, I don't know what. But we now see that kind of thing happening. And in fact, in the Diamond Exchange in Tel Aviv, right on the ground floor is a huge Bank of India for try to provide the financing for people who are coming there to be part of the diamonds market. And even the cover of our program today. All right, so here we have the Azrieli Towers. And this was taken from a section of Tel Aviv, Sarona, which was settled initially by the Germans in the 1880s to have a quasi-colony in the Holy Land. And then it became the German headquarters. And then during parts of World War II, and then it was the British headquarters during World War II. And then it was been head of the IDF. And now it's turned into this very upscale mall, which is really quite astonishing. It reminds me a lot of Boca Raton, with stunning apartment buildings going up, very high priced, gorgeous views, very short distance from the main downtown area, and very short distance from the beach. It's become a very popular area. And you get these nice views of the Azrieli Towers from there. And this month, the Tel Aviv subway has now being started. So we see some very exciting things there. And just a week and a half ago, I was at the Tel Aviv University for their opening day. And it was the wonderful buzz of excitement of new students coming to campus, including, by the way, many covered women. And right outside the Museum of the Diaspora, we have many booths set up of people offering goods and student activities and so on that central campus, trying to prepare people for their own futures in that country and perhaps elsewhere. So today we're going to really look now at the economic growth, both its good consequences and bad consequences in the country. And so we're very pleased to have first talking from a technology point of view, Eran Carmel, who grew up on Mount Carmel, Har Carmel, and just a little bit north of the high-tech wonderland that's between Herzliya and Haifa. And so he'll give us his perspective on what's happened there with the new class of entrepreneurs who've built great wealth there. And then we'll hear from Professor Goldshire, who's a sociologist who will give us an inside view of Israel's changing society and how different people of different groups are affected. So I'll now turn the floor over to Eran Carmel. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Richard attributed all of Israeli economic success recently to Stanley Fischer, and while I have great respect for Stanley Fischer, I don't think that's all Stanley Fischer. So, thank you, Richard. So, my talk is about how Israeli society was transformed as a result of high tech, and I'll try to answer that in my brief talk today. Let me take you back to 1998. One day in the spring of 1998, Israelis woke up to very interesting headlines, something that they had never seen before. 4 kids in their 20s, one of them had dreadlocks, Israeli kids, had started a firm on something called the internet. This was 1998. And the firm was called Mirabilis. And they were acquired by a large American company for $400 million. Now, that's 17 years ago. That was a lot. It's a lot of money today. It was a lot more money for 17 years ago. This was, as I look back historically at the Israeli economy and Israeli society and especially the Israeli high-tech scene, this was an inflection point. This was the beginning of a new era where Israelis began to view themselves differently than they had been before. Just a couple of one more quick comment on that. The team was led by the fathers of one of the four, a guy by the name of Yossi Vardi, who became, in some ways, the spokesperson for Israeli high-tech. And he coined a very nice expression. Back at that time, ICQ was a young firm. It was almost a nascent firm, really, the firm that was the Israeli firm. And he said, no profits, no problem. No revenues, no problem. And that's something that Yossi Vardi coined, and Israelis believed in it for a while. Now, Israeli high-tech, to be precise, was not born in the spring of 1998. There was the runway was quite substantial. Before that, there were serious firms there without both multinationals as well as Israeli homegrown companies. Those of you who were around back then, Tadiran, Cytex, Elbit, Elsint were serious companies that were exporting and were international players. But Israel was not the nation that it is today. So the argument that I want to make to you is that Israeli society was transformed as a result of high-tech, or at least changed substantially. Transformation is a very strong term. I want to be careful with that. Now, let me contrast Israel with India. I'm a high-tech scholar, and one of the fascinating countries that I've witnessed grow in the last 20 years is India. India was transformed by high-tech, by information technology specifically. I would argue Israel has not been transformed as substantially as India, and I've visited India a number of times. When you go to India, you see parts of cities transformed because of information technology. The huge tech parks that are built on the peripheries of all Indian cities are changing India in a transformational way, have already changed India in a transformational way. I don't see it quite as sharply in Israel. Next is the issue of the national narrative. I think that this is very important. India has new heroes, without question. Indian mothers, certainly a decade ago, and perhaps to some extent today, they want all their sons and daughters to be Bill Gates, and you hear this when they speak. And this is quite profound. Let me also do one more clarification at the beginning. I see a difference between the impact of the high-tech sector, which has been enormously successful, and the opening up of Israel to globalization. The opening up of Israel to globalization began in the very late 90s and early 1990s when the government began to open up the Israeli market, and the globalization that we see not just in Israel but in many other emerging nations began. Those of us who grew up in Israel of a long time ago, we remember supermarkets that were sparse and poor compared to American supermarkets. As a result, immediately in the 1990s, as a result of the privatization, the globalization, Israeli supermarkets look like American supermarkets. They're wealthy, there's a lot of selection, there's the competition that we are now accustomed to in the last 20 years. That had nothing to do with high tech. So I do not want to attribute so many facets of globalization to high tech. I want to focus on what really happened in Israel as a result of the amazing success of high tech. My argument is that I have 9 points that I want to make about that. First of all, the national let me start with the macroeconomic. Richard has already mentioned a few points, but let me emphasize Israel is now part of the OECD. Most of the majority of Israeli exports are high-tech today. That wasn't true a generation or two ago. Remember Java oranges and diamonds and so on. There are about 200 to 250,000 employees who are directly in the high-tech sector. Now, that's a small part of the labor force, but remember that there's brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers and wives and so on. So a lot of people are affected by high-tech. Currently, these are fresh pieces of data. There's 5,500 startups in Israel, which is an enormous number. It's probably more than in all of Washington, all of Greater Washington, and many other major cities. The forecast for 2015 is that Israel will have about $9 billion worth of exits. Those of you who don't know what exits are, go to Israel because exit is used in every other sentence. An exit is when an entrepreneur cashes out on the company, the startup typically. So the forecast is for $9 billion, and now we're in October. The country is well on its way to $9 billion. That's a very large number, much larger than Washington and Baltimore and Philadelphia combined, just for comparison. Just in the third quarter of 2015, Israel had $700 million of venture capital invested in its startup area. Again, much larger than any metropolitan city in the United States, save for Silicon Valley. One of my little pieces of research was I wanted to look at the billionaires in Israel. There are 17 billionaires on the Forbes list of the wealthiest people in the world. It's a pretty substantial number, by the way. 4 of the billionaires are from high tech. However, in the macroeconomic sense, we all want to believe that all boats rise as a result of this incredible success and wealth. But as Calvin will talk about in just a few minutes, that hasn't been the case in Israel. The income gap has widened substantially since a generation ago, and that is probably a direct result of this wealth in high tech. Let me talk about the national narrative now. The national narrative, I believe, in Israel has changed. Israelis now tell themselves a variation on "We are a startup nation." Startup nation. This is a new term. It was coined by some Americans. Nevertheless, in one way or another, it's now the new narrative. 15 years ago, it was "We are Silicon Wadi," like Silicon Valley. It's a play on the Hebrew-Arabic name. Now it's "We are a startup nation." So it's the high-tech success that brings Israelis their story about themselves, about why they've been successful, why they're successful today. And I would argue that there's a little bit of a new Zionism in all of this. In the old days, it used to be the Hagshama to go to the kibbutz. A couple of generations ago. Now it's a company like Waze, which is enormously successful, and it held out from a big American acquirer and who wanted to move their R&D to the United States, and the Waze founders said, no, that's a deal breaker for us. We want to sell out, but we want to leave Israeli R&D here in Israel. This is the new Zionism, I would argue. Next is our heroes. Who are the heroes in Israel? And this is interesting. In the generation I grew up, we read stories about Meir Har-Zion, who was a paratrooper, a buddy of Arik Sharon. He did daring things with a gun. Those were the national heroes. Now, in the United States, we talk about heroes like Steve Jobs, right? But remember that Steve Jobs really only became a hero in the last few years before his death, and certainly after his death. I don't think that there are quite the figures in Israeli high-tech of a Steve Jobs. None of them are as charismatic as Steve Jobs is portrayed to us today. Gil Shved, the founder of Checkpoint, is one of the richest men in Israel. He's worth over $2 billion, and he's an amazing entrepreneur and a very good man. But he doesn't have the charisma of one of those. The 2 brothers from Rad who founded Rad, they're closer to my age, Zohar Zisapel and his brother Yuda probably would come close to some extent. Again, they don't have quite the draw. I thought of Shai Agassi, and when I talked to one of my, Shai Agassi, who was the founder of Better Place, the green cars, which of course failed a few years ago. Shai Agassi is a great spokesperson, a little bit like Bibi. But my CEO friend who I talked to last week in the preparation for this, he told me, oh no, Shai Agassi is not a hero. He is such a bad manager. So I'll give that as a caveat there. So that's the national heroes. Point number 4 is the landscape. How do we see this? So I said the challenge is India. You go to India and you see cities transformed because of high tech. I don't think that you see it quite as much as Israel. The Israeli towers were built not for high tech, but because of the globalization and other facets of Israeli economy. So the cities are not as transformed. Of course, you see high-tech parks, but they're not as strong. There's an enormous concentration of population around in Tel Aviv because of very similar to Silicon Valley. The best and the brightest, the money, they all go to Silicon Valley here in the United States around Stanford and San Francisco and the Bay Area. We see this in Tel Aviv and Herzliya and Ramat HaChayal and all those peripheral suburbs of Tel Aviv. I think that we see the same phenomena as we're seeing in Silicon Valley in terms of concentration. Now, having said that, we're seeing some minor changes in landscape in the city more recently. We see like the emergence of a Haifa suburb of Yokneam, which used to be kind of in the middle of nowhere I'm from Haifa, and now is a small cluster of medical tech. And we see Beersheva emerge as a cyber city around Ben Gurion University and the cyber command of the Israeli military. And this was set up just a few years ago with the help of Jerusalem Venture Partners, JVP, and it's around where the famous Unit 8200 is, the elite Israeli intelligence and cyber city is. There's already 5,000 employees in this cyber cluster in Beersheva, and they already had 3 exits in the last few years, which is a real mark of success. Remember, an exit is cashing out for many, many millions of dollars, usually. Point number 5 is the military. In the generation that I grew up in, we were all told the slogan "Hatovim Latais," so the best would go to be pilots or to be paratroopers. Now a lot of the best don't go necessarily to those, but they go into various cyber military areas. Israelis know that the future wars will be fought and won or lost to some extent, or to a large extent, in the cyber arena. So the military is also changing. Point number 6 is the lifestyle. I would argue that 20 years ago Israel was, I wouldn't say a late adopter, but certainly not an early adopter of technology, of new gizmos, of computing, of technology. Today, Israelis are at the forefront. When I read the Israeli newspapers, as I scan them every day, I see stuff there that I don't see here in the American press. So it's a good way for me to follow technology. Israelis are very attuned to the latest gadgets and technology, so they are now an early adopter. Another part of lifestyle is, I would argue, and this is connected to my point about the heroes, is that maybe because Israelis haven't developed high-tech heroes like a Steve Jobs or a generation ago a Bill Gates. Bill Gates used to be a hero, believe it or not, here in the U.S. But it's the idealized version of being a startupist, as Israelis would say, is the work hard, play hard ethic of being in a startup, working all day and all night, and then going out to party in Tel Aviv. This is, I think, part of a lifestyle that's attractive to the young people, and I think part of Israeli culture now. Point 7 is business. The worship of the startup that I just mentioned and the entrepreneurship is a transformation. Israelis did not see their national narrative as necessarily being a startupist or an entrepreneur. They saw themselves as going to work in a kibbutz or be pioneers along the borders. So now they're talking about agri-tech and green tech and water tech. These Israelis now have entrepreneurial experience. They're serial entrepreneurs. They do one after another, and they take their business and entrepreneurship learning and bring it to the next frontier of technology. Point number 8 is education and labor markets. So we see universities changing as a result of this success, and one example is computer science. 2 Israeli universities are at the top 20 of the Shanghai listing of the best computer science departments in the world, and that's the Technion in Haifa and the Tel Aviv University. So Technion is rated 18 and Tel Aviv 20. Now that's remarkable. All the others in the top 20 pretty much are American. So this speaks to this symbiosis effect between education and the success of high tech, is that the universities are developing around that. Israelis clearly select degrees in part based on the success of high tech. In all universities, computers and software engineering and cybersecurity and so on are very successful. Now, high tech does have some positive impact on narrowing the gap, and without trying to get into that too much, I'll mention the effect of some isolated examples of high tech going into the 2 most disadvantaged areas, which are the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab populations of Israel. And there's some positive impact there, especially a company called Matrix, which is in Modi'in Elite, which has hundreds of Haredi women, again, ultra-Orthodox women who are working in high tech and are very successful. And now, because the women have been successful, now the men are getting into it. And my friend told me of a very recent case, which I wasn't familiar with, which now the Haredi men who are being trained in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. At age 18, they had nothing. All they had were religious studies until 18, and within 2 years, they're very successful engineers because they're such good scholars. It's in their blood. So finally, the last point is politics. We don't, the tradition is that Israeli businessmen don't go into politics quite that much. Different political culture than here. But I, as a high-tech person, I like to see Israeli high-tech people go into politics. And let me mention the three most prominent ones these days. It's really the first generation of the high-techistim in Israeli politics. They span the political map. The most prominent, of course, is Naftali Bennett. He cashed out for at least $7 million with his startup, so he's successful, very well known in the high-tech area. Then there's the mayor of Jerusalem, Naftali Bennett. He's a member of the cabinet, and he's from the Jewish Home Party. Next is Nir Barkat, the mayor of Jerusalem. He cashed out for at least $125 million. Very wealthy man. He's been mayor of Jerusalem for a few years. And finally, a newcomer to this is from the labor Zionist camp movement, is Erel Margalit. He was one of the founders of JVP, Jerusalem Venture Partners. He's considered one of the best venture capitalists in Israel, and he cashed out for at least $60 million. So these are very nice examples of this new generation transforming perhaps politics as well. Will they make an impact in politics? Naftali Bennett certainly is, so there is some evidence of that. And so, in summary, I think that high tech has made a substantial impact on Israel, maybe even a transformation. Thank you.
Would you like to buy a watch?
Make a next thing, please.
I'm going to take a somewhat broader view of the economic changes or the economic transformation in Israel. And I want to present some background to that by looking at a variety of empirical indicators which show the growth in the economy of the state of Israel. And it's been very impressive, comparatively and relative to its own development over the last several decades. And without exception, all these economic indicators show the major transformations in economic development over the past several decades, including the growth in major sectors of the economy. We heard about one sector just now, the expansion of export markets, the increased consumption, the extension of higher levels of living to its diverse population. But this is the puzzle. As Israel's economy expanded and institutions established to maintain continuous growth, new and unprecedented questions about economic and related forms of inequality emerged. These forms revolve around the generational transmission of social class, of money, and other inequalities, the differential retention of economic resources and wealth among families, and the continuing economic gap between Jews and Arab Palestinians, as well as among Jews of different ethnic origins. Socioeconomic differences among ethnic and religious groups are indicators of inequality. It becomes problematic when there's evidence of the generational persistence of social class and when ethnic, religious, socioeconomic distinctiveness means economic disadvantage. And most distressing of all is the ideological context, founded on the basis of egalitarian values and the commitment of political institutions to reduce obvious economic differences among groups. Think about the origins of the kibbutz, the socialist political parties. What happened that would lead to both economic development and to social inequality? On the one hand, there are major signs of convergence and cohesion among ethnic and religious groups and social class mobility between the generations. The questions of inequalities in Israel are not simple. They're not primarily theoretical or ideological or purely economic. So I want to address two critical but complex sets of empirical issues. First, how do we identify changes over time in the manifestations of economic and social inequality, and hence to locate the balance between inequality and cohesion? Second, we need to explore the major factors that are linked to inequality and national integration and how these have changed over time. That is, what determines these changes over time, and therefore have some clue about to understand them. My fundamental argument is, and has been for a while, that Israeli society over the last several decades has undergone significant social and economic transformations, resulting in new forms of cohesion and new sources of conflict. These changes have resulted in critical alterations of major features of Israeli society, including unexpected forms of inequality and discrimination. And I want to talk about how this came about. Let's consider the basic question about economic resources, the changing structure of inequality in Israel, the overlap of social class hierarchy with ethnic origins of the population, and the persistence of social class differences generationally. How are the sources of inequality connected to nation building, internal to the institutions of the society, and to changes brought about by immigration and or ethnic competition? Are income gaps between social classes and ethnic religious groups greater now than a decade ago? We'll take a short-term view of this. The answer to the persistence, convergence, and transmission generationally of economic resources helps us better understand how Israeli society and its policy, and its policies have altered the basis of socio-ethnic inequality. Now, in all societies, there is an educational, occupational distribution. Some groups have more education than others and are in higher paying and more prestigious jobs. There are always differences in all societies in how economic resources and income are distributed at any point in time. However, when differences in socioeconomic levels and resources are transmitted generationally and reinforced institutionally, the resultant hierarchy is referred to as inequality or social stratification. Hence, social class differences among immigrant populations, as Israel is an immigrant society in large part, are expected. We expect that there will be differences because differences are an outcome of the historical circumstances of where they come from, of the resources they brought with them, the economic context facing them when they arrived, as well as the government resources that are allocated to generate equal access. So we ask, are the economic disparities in Israel transferred to the next generation? You're wonderful, thank you. This is actually vodka. So my focus is on generational changes. My focus is on the Israeli-born, because that's the critical question. And now we're talking about the second and third generation, and the persistence of this inequality over time. So I'm going to start with some very basic and simple questions which have to do with what determines the distribution of resources and the set of economic inequalities. You know the answers to this, but I wasn't sure when I started what the answer might be. Let's consider the role of education. We learn about high tech, you've got to have a certain level of education, some specific, some general education in order to move in that direction. And education is linked to jobs, it's linked to income, it's linked to where you live, it's linked to government policies. So what have been the changes over time? As the State of Israel grew demographically and economically, education levels of the population increased, networks of schools expanded, new economies were established, opportunities for attending school were extended, indeed required of all citizens. Public elementary, high schools, colleges, and universities developed to accommodate the needs of an increasing and diverse population, to educate the next generation in the political goals of the state, and to address the economic demands of an expanding and diversified labor market. That's what education does. And the values placed on education were fairly high. There was an easy transference, easy in quotation marks, between the emphasis on religious education to the emphasis on secular education in the State of Israel. Now, the key is that high levels of education provided access to jobs, better jobs, and higher income, and were a basis for intergenerational social mobility. People could move up as a result different than their parents because they got a better education than their parents. So job opportunities expanded, industries developed to meet the increasing number of people participating in the labor force, as well as the economic goals of the state. So what happened to the nature of educational distribution within the population? And here, I make a living about taking simple things and making them complex. So I'm going to tell you, firstly, it seems as if the average number of years of schooling provides the first clues about the complexities of ethnicity, generational change, and stratification. The core finding from a large number of detailed studies show that Israeli Jews from Western countries, those from Europe or America, have higher levels of education than those from Asian and African countries. Not a very astounding finding. Among the foreign-born, the differences in education are greater than among the Israeli-born, as the education gap declined by the second and later generations. So there's been a convergence, there's been a decline in this average education and differences between different groups, critical groups within the country. And that was not because one group changed, but that all groups were exposed to higher levels of education within Israel over the last generation. And clearly, starting at a lower level, those from Asian and African countries, those from Middle Eastern countries, say, started at a lower level, so their range increased more. Again, not surprising, although very interesting. But if you look not at the average educational level, but you focus on the entire distribution of education, then we get more complex. If you examine the upper educational levels, that is those who have more than a high school or more than a college education, small generational changes have occurred for both of the major ethnic categories, and the retention of higher levels of that upper level of education, rather than the average, but the upper level. So among the Western origin population, almost twice as many, listen to the data. I know that you're used to listening to stories, but let me tell you a little bit about empirical evidence. Almost twice as many Israeli-born of European origin Jews had 13 to 15 years of education than Israeli-born of Asian and African origin. And 3 times as many had more than a college education. So if you think of the demands of high-tech and other kinds of advanced jobs, the people who have access to them are those who have higher levels of education. And here you have, at that level, the generation associated with the Western origin population. So at the upper level of education, the ethnic gap, the gap between those of Western origin and those of Middle Eastern origin, second generation now and third, at the beginning of the 21st century, was about the same for the first and second generation immigrants. Very little change over time, not in the level of education, not in the average, but in the gap between these groups. And that's what I want you to think about in terms of inequality, that gap. So time, generation, has not eliminated, but has reduced some of these ethnic divisions. But if you incorporate within this conversation a substantial proportion of the population called Arab populations, citizens of the state, and I'm talking only about Arab citizens of the state, that difference has not been reduced at all. So you have here a problem of a state, and I use it crudely for these three groups. Gaps at the upper level haven't changed at all for the Jewish groups, and for Arabs and Arab Palestinians, or whatever they're called, Arab Israelis, who are citizens of the state, hasn't changed at all relative to both the Israeli group of Western origin and the Israeli group of Middle Eastern origin. So, and these changes came about as a result of policies. Remember that the Israeli government didn't say, well, go ahead, you get an education, it's up to you, and if you fail, it's your fault. To the contrary, they worked very hard in terms of policy to try to reduce this gap, which they knew existed within the Jewish population among immigrants from various countries. And they expanded it, and as a result of that, as a result of a number of other policies, which I won't go into here, not in Herzliya and not in Tel Aviv, but in other parts of the country, in development towns, for example, where a quarter to a third of the population lived from Asian and African countries, from Middle Eastern countries, the kinds of schools they set up were vocational schools, as they set up types of vocational schools in other areas. And that development meant a continuing reinforcement of a difference. Those who could get out of places of segregation, of ethnic segregation, they moved out, which resulted that they did better. But what happened to the residual population? They got worse. So the gap increased. The same thing is true with regard to jobs. If you look at the kinds of industries, and I won't go into that in any great detail either, but if you look at the proportion in high-level jobs, not only high-tech, but upper-level managers, professionals, and so on, you find that the relative rank of ethnic groups has remained relatively the same for first and second and third generation. And I'll have a little footnote. We know very little about the third generation because the Israeli government, in its wisdom, doesn't ask the question about who were your grandparents, because for them, ethnicity is defined as what was the place of origin of your father. But I pressed for many years, get some kind of data on ethnic origin. And they said, well, the ethnic origin of all our population is Israeli. That's their ethnic origin. That's their ethnic identity. And so they never ask a question about the third generation. We have some surveys which have gotten some data on that. But everything that I tell you is actually true for both the second and third generations as well. Again, for jobs, changes have occurred for all groups, but the pace of changes is much more intensive among the Western origin population. They've retained their rank in terms of higher levels of jobs and much higher than the Arab Israeli population. Now, one thing that happens, and it's always puzzling, if you ask Israelis, is there a problem about growing inequality, the answer often is, well, I'm doing much better than my parents, much better than my grandparents. If that's the reference group, they're right. Of course they're doing better than their parents and grandparents. But if the reference is to other groups who've made it, if that's the comparative group, they're not doing so well. And they know that. You just have to learn to ask the right questions. I don't want to reinforce the question of residence and residential segregation, but one of the key factors associated with the retention of inequality that exists in Israel is the very important levels of segregation, residential segregation, that has occurred in Israel and continues to characterize the country. Whether they are in areas outlying the country, whether they're areas even within major metropolitan areas, just as there are segregated areas of high tech, there are segregated areas of disadvantage, and they continue over time. It's hard to break out of it. And remember that the educational system was designed to raise the level of education of everyone, and there's another set of institutions which was also designed to do that. And that was the military, of course. The army, everything was going to be equal in the army. And of course, the army has to draw people who are more into those high-level positions within the army from people who are better educated. The better go into higher-level positions in the army. And the army, it's tied into neighborhoods. It's tied into schooling. So, in fact, it reinforces inequality. I learned when I was in the Israeli army, I learned one thing, that taught me what the nature of inequality and disadvantage was. It's not that people don't become disadvantaged despite the army, but because of the army. That is, they reinforce it. Again, no one is an evil player here. No one has any intention, I hope. But no one really intends it to retain this level of inequality, but it is one of the consequences of rapid growth and the kind of growth that has occurred. Are there other paths to reduce inequality? If education sets for at least a whole generation what that means, is there a way out of it? Well, the only way that I know of beyond education, given the structure of the economy and the structure of education, is through what social scientists call, and economists call, a self-employment through networks. So instead of working to get a job by way of education, you get a job because you know somebody's uncle's brother, sister, and then you marry her. So networks are very powerful as a means to overcome some of the limitations of education. And think for a moment about two kinds of situations. A situation where people from those of Western origin who have powerful networks and have had powerful networks for generations, much more powerful than other ethnic communities. And think about Arab Palestinians in Israel whose networks are extremely limited in terms of getting out. After the first set of jobs that the Arab Palestinians, Arab Israelis, talking again about the citizens of the state, they got jobs and they got a little bit of education, and yes, they moved into somewhat higher level occupations. Those occupations dried out after a very short period of time. And therefore, the Arab Palestinian population had one choice. If they wanted a job, they'd have to move into the Jewish sector, right? They'd have to work in the Jewish sector. And think about if you have to hire your new son-in-law or your grandson-in-law, and you had to hire that person at whatever the level of education is, and you have an Arab Palestinian also applying for that job, who might have priority? And the answer is Arab Palestinians suffer a continuous disadvantage. Now, what about the new immigration? I'll talk very briefly about the new immigration and what that has done. The influx of Russian immigrants that helped move ahead this technological industries of all kinds. It became clear that the path to income and occupational success has primarily been for them through educational attainment. Networks work, but educational attainment is there, particularly at the higher levels. Those without educational attainment at the higher levels are likely to be left behind in this new technological world of occupations in Israel in the 21st century. Now, education leads to jobs, it leads to income, and I'm going to cite two facts and then try to wrap up a little bit. We know that education leads to jobs, job leads to money, unless you inherit it. Looking at the latest data from the Central Bureau of Statistics of Israel, income gaps between the highest and lowest levels in the income distribution, take the top 10% and the bottom 10% or 20%, it doesn't matter what you take. Average income in Israel after taxes for the wealthiest 20% of Israelis is 7.5 times higher than the poorest 20%. And that's called inequality. And this income gap, I say it's static, but over the last 10, 20 years has increased over time. So the income gap between those at the highest levels and those at the lowest levels has increased. And we heard earlier about the OECD and about international comparison and the great role of Israel in that and its success. And in a recent study of 27 countries in the European Union, the number of Israelis who risk falling below the poverty line has increased, in part because of the very large and increasing Arab Israeli and ultra-Orthodox Haredi population. The two poorest communities in Israel, although some have changed in the recent period, it hasn't affected most of the Haredim who are in fact unemployed. Both men and women, and certainly do not have the kind of schooling to compete in expanding areas of high technology. And according to this OECD comparative study, the largest amount of inequality of any country in the OECD comparison is the state of Israel. And again, in sharp contrast to the ideology and the vision of the founders of Israeli society of socioeconomic equality and the breakdown of generational social class persistence. So let me just conclude briefly by summarizing some of these points. I found these points very disturbing when I began studying them and looking at the detailed evidence. I hope you do too. Intergenerational mobility, that is movement between the generations, has not closed the educational or occupational gap between ethnic origin Jewish groups and their children. Every ethnic group has been characterized by social mobility. Everybody has gotten better. There has been significant social mobility, but the ethnic gap has not diminished, and at times it has widened. Thus, inequalities have persisted even with rapid economic development and economic growth and new opportunities in a relatively open stratification system. I would say not even with, but because of the type of distribution of economic changes. And this has intensified in the last quarter of a century. Ethnic differences in economic, social, cultural, and political spheres extend to the second and third generations. Social and economic inequality can only partially be explained by different socioeconomic backgrounds of these ethnic groups. So exposure to Israeli society has led to social mobility, but reinforced disadvantage among some as the economy has changed and demands for a more educated labor force increase. The economic integration of immigrant populations in Israel resulted in continuing forms of ethnic distinctiveness, and social mobility did not necessarily result in greater equality or in the elimination of socioeconomic gaps between groups. It reflects in part the ethnic residential segregation and within large metropolitan areas, and that's a central feature of what happens. And it applies to ethnic divisions among the Jewish population and even more clearly characterizes the Arab-Jewish distinction. The immigration of a large number of Russian immigrants in the 1990s with higher levels of education and occupational experience has resulted in the perpetuation of the ethnic gap that disadvantages those from Asian and African origins. And this may be particularly the case among the children of Russian immigrants who are likely to attain even higher levels of education and become more prepared for Israel's expanding technological sectors. Now, my focus has really been on economic gaps and economic differences, but that's not the only manifestation of ethnic inequality, and I'll mention just a few more to tell you that this is a very broad-ranged set of inequalities. Ethnic differences in rates of mortality, ethnic differences in health show how socioeconomic differences are translated into life chances. Ethnicity and gender are often intertwined, so gender is another significant form of inequality. I won't tell you the most shocking piece of information that I discovered is that in the original kibbutzim and the socialist kibbutzim in Israel were characterized as the highest level of occupational segregation by gender in all of Israeli society, despite whatever. What? Well, they don't exist anymore. Israeli kibbutzim are beyond that, but still, right? Because who gets the jobs, who gets the managerial positions, and so on. Excuse me? They're now the poorest because they're not subsidized. Socioeconomic differences are therefore not the only manifestation. These gender differences are important. These ethnic distinctiveness really is retained at the family and household level. And I would argue that they're reinforced by government policies and priorities, especially when major investments are made in areas outside of the formal boundaries of the state, where the priorities are set and invested in settlements outside of the state of Israel. That is the settlements. So, and there's a higher priority there. They're invested there, and they're not necessarily invested in other places. The vision of the founders of Israel of an egalitarian society in Israel for Jews and Arabs, for men, for women, for immigrants, and the native-born remains an unfulfilled vision of the future. Perhaps more than reinventing Israel is the need to selectively recapture the vision of the past. Thank you. And if you have any questions, ask Aaron.
Okay, very interesting and provocative look. We'll take some questions now. Yes, sir. Okay.
You can have it after me. So my name is Shira Pindyke. I'm a student at the University of Pennsylvania.
It's on, you just have to speak up.
Okay. Now you can hear me? Yes?
Yes.
I'm a student at the University of Pennsylvania. I wanted to thank both of the speakers for your lectures today. My question, I would like to raise the issue that Calvin brought up, the idea of gender in this construct, specifically to Iran. You spoke to the idea of the idea of the new emerging elite, and how we see this in both the military and in the workforce with the high tech, and how it's trickled down to the political leaders who have cashed out. And I noticed that all of the political leaders you mentioned were all men who've cashed out from this industry. And I was hoping you could speak to the implications of this. If this industry is producing the country's new political leaders, and all of these people who have cashed out are men, what are the gendered implications of this?
I think you raise a very good question. I don't have data on that. It's not something that I study. We should. I was first erred, by the way, in using the term cash out, because Israel say exit. They exited, exitim. And so there are very few women. We see the same situation we see in Israel as we see in Silicon Valley. The glass ceiling, whether it exists or not, we see the outcomes are the same. All the high-tech firms here in Silicon Valley are, almost all of them are founded and led by men. And the same pretty much we see in Israel today. So very similar to Silicon Valley.
My name is Herbert Grossman. I'm a retired judge. My question is, you had 9 points on why Israel has advanced so much. You left out one point that I think is very significant, and which is actually now.
Put the microphone in front of your mouth, please.
And I'm concerned that there will be a negative effect on Israel, and that is the influx. You can't hear me? The influx of 1 million Russian Jews who are highly educated in science and technology. And I would think that was probably the greatest factor in Israel getting to where it is. You don't have another 1 million Russian Jews coming into the country. And I'm concerned about the educational system in Israel. How will it compensate for not having the educational system in Russia that educated these immigrants? How is Israel going to fare without that? Mr. Carmel.
So I know that some of the narrative of why Israel is a successful startup nation is because of the huge influx of 1 million Soviet-born Jews in the early 1990s. And I think that it is an important factor, but it's certainly not the only factor. If you look at who the founders and the leaders of the startups are in Israel, while some of them are first or second generation from that big wave, many of them are not. And so I don't want to attribute, I don't buy into that narrative that it's because of the Soviet wave. That's not the case. It's a confluence of a number of factors. I'd like my colleague to talk about education.
The point is that the influx of Russian immigrants to the state of Israel, the influence has been great, enormous impact. It affects not only specific industries, it affects the whole distribution of education. It affects where the Russians are living, what areas they have settled in, what schools their children go to, and what their aspirations are for education. So it affects a great many things. It affects the religious distribution within the country, because many of them define themselves as not Jewish, not Arab, but somehow Israelis, which is the new category, and a very problematic one indeed. And they're faced with that problem. But they're faced essentially with what kind of education they want to provide for their children. And my feeling is that we will know the impact of the Russian immigration on the educational system only in the next generation. It was a selective immigration of Russians who came in. Not all of them were well educated, but many of them were. But it changed what I see as the bigger picture, the relationship between groups of people within the state. And the Russians have had a major impact. All you have to do is exit the country, and you'll see the signs in Hebrew, in Russian, and sometimes on the bottom in English. But basically, the Russians have taken over a great deal.
And I would say that the popular conception in Israel is that the best schools, the best performing schools in national comparisons are of Russian immigrants. So they're perpetuating this with the next generation. Okay, the gray sweater in the back. Oh, you're all right. So Laura, you're picking it. Okay.
I just like to follow up on that question, not about immigration, but emigration, for both speakers. The World Bank data is surprisingly showing that for the last number of years, more Israelis have been leaving than coming. We see here at this conference, if you look at the number of the speakers who were Israelis or who were living in Israel, now living in here, evidence for a brain drain. It's the networking point suggests that these high-tech exiters, or those who haven't exited, are tied into networks all over the world, including Silicon Valley, and have outlets for their second homes, third homes, and capital that may have implications. So I'd like to get your response to each of you to the impact of the particular kind of emigration that we're seeing, and the opportunities for emigration, and the investment of this wealth outside of Israel.
Let me just, I'll just briefly, the evidence on emigration and the, quote, perception of increased emigration is a powerful myth, but in fact it's been relatively stable over time. Now what you do have, and I think the important point, is that many of the Russians who came continued networks and ties in the former Soviet Union, in Russia, back there, and in other places within Europe and in the United States. So there's been a sense in which the Yemenites who came to Israel in the 1930s and 40s and 50s didn't establish networks back in Yemen. And the Moroccans didn't either. But the Americans did, because they weren't coming to Israel permanently anyway. They always got a round-trip ticket. But the Russians, in fact, developed a series, importantly, of networks elsewhere, connections. Many, surprisingly, retained their households in places of origin. So there is a connection, but it's hard to define them as immigrants, since they go for short visits and see some of their relatives and come back, just as Israelis of other immigrations come to AU and then go back because they don't like the weather here or something.
Iran?
So two things. One is I looked at Israeli Nobel Prize winners who are in economics or the sciences. Israel has 8 Nobel Prize recipients, 3 of which have left Israel and are in U.S. universities. And one of them is because he didn't get tenure at the Technion. So, so that I think is fairly powerful data about the brain drain. But from a high-tech perspective, we like to talk not about brain drain, but about brain circulation. Silicon Valley is built on networks and on ties between individuals and companies. It's very strong. It's a very key part of its success. So if we compare Israelis to the Taiwanese and the Chinese and the Indians, all 4 of these countries have enormously powerful clusters inside Silicon Valley that then are networked back to their home country, and that's really the secret sauce of their success. Groups that don't have those networks, Europeans, for example, are not as successful. So the Israelis in Silicon Valley, by the way, they just successfully lobbied for a direct flight between San Jose to Tel Aviv. This is a result of years of lobbying, and it was led by Oren of Oren's Hummus, which is a mecca for Israeli high-tech people in Silicon Valley. It now has two hummus places in Silicon Valley. It's an Israeli hummus, although it has a lot of, and I recommend it, it's great. But he led the lobby attempt to have a nonstop flight between Silicon Valley and Israel. And I think that this speaks to the importance of networks and the notion of dismissing, in part, the notion of this being a zero-sum game of brain drain.
I'd just like to add to that, El Al just started direct flights between Boston and Tel Aviv this summer as well. But a lot of the real estate investments that are happening in Eastern Europe are done by people who emigrated from those countries. So the big investments in real estate in Bulgaria are people who are Israelis now. And I actually knew a Japanese trading official who had offices in Israel who did no business with Israelis, but he worked a lot with the networks that were connected back to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and so on to try to find out who they should deal with in those countries. So they counted on that continuing relationship with the places they came from.
As a footnote, the technology itself facilitates this kind of networking in ways that weren't the case 20 years ago.
I'm Maurice Chochet. Mr. Carmel, I noticed in your talk you didn't mention the army and its contribution to the high tech in Israel. Correct me if I am wrong, but there were a lot of reports in the past that certain algorithms that were developed in the army helped the country in breaking military codes of Arab countries in the 60s even. Correct me if I am wrong. If we look at what happened the last few years from the media, the warm Stuxnet. So I assume that the army was the basis for preparing at least some of those whom you mentioned as high-tech successful. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, if those of you who haven't read Startup Nation, I recommend it. It's a wonderful, very readable book, and it talks a great deal about the point that's made by this gentleman here about the Israeli military's contribution to the success of high tech. But let me just emphasize that in my talk, I talked about how Israeli society is being transformed by high tech, not what are the roots of high tech in Israel. And as you pointed out correctly, certainly one of them is the military.
Okay.
Professor Goldscheider, would you like to comment about the political implications of the social and economic changes that you just described to us so well?
The political implications are very unpleasant, actually. As in some countries that I know very well, the Israeli political system reflects the will of the people. And so if the political system is problematic, then it reflects some of the inequalities that exist within the country itself. So the country is often very split between those who want to reinforce and redevelop education, pay attention to those in poverty, pay attention to those who are disadvantaged and have been left behind. I can't say that the current government is moving in that direction. And the current government, it seems to me, has pulled back a great deal of the basis for changing that social inequality by investing, as I suggested just briefly at the end, in places in new settlements and in areas outside of the state of Israel, the territories administered, occupied, whatever you want to call it, outside. And that investment is not, I'm not suggesting they shouldn't invest that. That's another question. But it's investing because there's a set of priorities. Where do you build? Where do you set the schools? And what is the composition of that group that's settling in those areas? And that's the powerful question. Where should the government invest, given their current priorities? And unfortunately, the government has not recognized the increasing level of inequality. The government has not recognized ways to deal with it in a policy sense. And I would argue that have withdrawn resources and will pay a very heavy price in the next generation. So things are not very optimistic.
We want to leave time for lunch, so I'm going to take, did you have a question? 3 quick questions. Can you ask them and then you'll answer them, okay?
Okay.
And introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Vera Cento, and I'm from the Silicon Valley. I'm very familiar with the Oren Hummus and everything there. And just like a comment to what you said before, in terms of the military and the community, of the high-tech community, there was a reunion party for one of the units in the army that that focuses on high tech, and this reunion was in the Silicon Valley, so that's kind of. But a question regarding the Orthodox Jews. A lot of what you said seemed to be blaming the government for the way that the support for certain kind of educations and so on. But I wonder, at least in terms of the Orthodox Jews, they do get a lot of funding. And maybe we have to look at it as a separate story that the inequality doesn't come necessarily from funding or from policies of the government only, but also from the choices of the community.
Susan Becker from the IMF. Just really quick questions. When you did this study, did you look at Gini coefficients over time?
Yes.
Also comparing to the rate, the change in technology? Because we actually worked on a paper on different countries. Because it's what we found in the other countries we looked at. This is the same result whenever you have rapid growth. You have rapid growth, you get greater income inequality.
Including this country.
In this country, in every
Everywhere,
country.
everywhere.
Over time, I've worked with Yemenite immigration in the 40s and 50s, and later with Ethiopian immigration in the 80s and 90s. And on a recent trip back to Israel, I went to visit some of these communities, and they seem to be absolutely static in economic and social terms. And the gaps between them and the rest of the community are growing exponentially. So my question is, what efforts have been made in terms of affirmative action for these very, very disadvantaged groups?
Thank you. People, high-tech entrepreneurs or other people, can be involved in politics by becoming politicians, but maybe more generally, they become involved in politics in other ways, by playing a role behind the scene, by using their money, by using their influence in other ways. And I'm curious, I guess, for both speakers, the extent to which that seems to be happening. I would think from a business perspective, the high-tech community has a big investment in the educational integrity of the educational system, also a big investment in openness of the Israeli economy to the world, which I would think has some implications for the political situation and the way we normally think about Israeli politics.
The questions are all complex and interesting, and I won't spend more than an hour answering them. I'll start just very briefly. With regard to the Orthodox, you're absolutely right. The government invests a great deal in education of the Orthodox, but the question is not the investment, but what kind of education they're getting. And what is the nature of the educational system within various religious school systems. And it's usually not anything to do with what we would call modern secular education, and therefore they're not being prepared for this. Some of the women are, because the women work and the men are doing the important work of being on fellowship in yeshivot, right? They have fellowships, but so they don't work to do that, and therefore aren't contributing, and therefore end up at the bottom of the occupational distribution. So it's not only the government investment, you're absolutely right. It has to do with what kind of education it is and what people want. There is a case to be made that in all of the countries with rapid economic growth, you have this development of inequality. And in the study that I saw, using the Gini coefficient, Israel comes out the highest level of inequality of any country in the OECD. Exactly the case. Not true. Not true. I will give you the reference. I'll give you the reference. I was shocked to see it, but it is true. I'm not going to argue about what the data show. I can only say I was surprised to see it, That was the last study that I saw, and using not only the Gini coefficient, but a variety of other indicators.
Let me reconcile. They're at least at the very bottom, both U.S. and Israel.
Yeah, but you have a major influence of the government who changes that, and you don't have that influence in other places. So it depends whether you check it before the government intervention or after.
I'm just looking at the data as of 2012 or 2013.
There's a brand new World Bank study from last year.
I can't wait to read it.
It's been out.
I haven't read it. I can only tell you the data that I've seen suggests a very high level of inequality relative to other countries. It doesn't make it any worse. It doesn't make it any better when you do the comparative analysis. It puts it into perspective that rapid economic growth often leaves people at the bottom as well as increasing people at the top. You heard about the top. There is also a bottom of disadvantaged people and so on, which is an answer to the question about Yemenite communities. You went back to Yemenite communities, and you were seeing the residual, those people who were left behind. The people who made it in the Yemenite community don't live in the same communities that their parents grew up in or that they grew up in. So what you're looking at is the residual, which means a very selective out-migration which occurs. We haven't talked about selective out-migration within the state of Israel, which is very powerful. And that's why the development towns, which had always been neglected in a variety of ways, when anybody could make it, the select numbers who could make it, left, and those who remained back were doubly disadvantaged. Affirmative action. Someplace I read recently, Israel is not into affirmative action. They tried, and they have worked very hard to try to reduce some forms of inequality and some forms, and have been successful. So if you look at health, and if you look at mortality rates, infant mortality rates, no ethnic differences whatsoever, and very little ethnic differences between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis. There have been a major attempt. Health systems are very different because they are located in various institutions, heavily supported by the government. So there's been some success, some reduction of inequality, but I'm always surprised after 2 or 3 generations, after 60 years or 50 years, an enormous amount of inequality persists in major areas of social life. You can have all the rest.
So I was asked about the impact on Israeli politics of the high-tech, the new Nouveau-riche high-tech. So I want to be optimistic. I grew up in high-tech. I study high-tech. I think that these people are problem solvers and they're doers. And so I'm optimistic about their impact. I don't like Naftali Bennett. He's not my political taste, but he is a doer, and he has transformed Israeli politics. So that's an interesting example. And here you can think of, so let me do a quiz. Which of the Republican presidential contenders is a high-tech person? Let's see who the first one is here. Who? Carly Fiorina. Yeah, she took one of America's largest high-tech firms and she
ruined
destroyed
it.
Ruined it.
Ruined
so,
it.
So you never know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have.
I have a
Okay, we have.